Hello, welcome everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak, Strategy and Future. With me, Nicholas Myers. Hi, Nick.
Good morning.
It's Sunday, the 27th of February, the fifth day of the war between Russia and Ukraine, and this is the report of what has been happening and what is our assessment, what's going on, and what might happen in the near future. Nick, the floor is yours.
So again, as I said on our last talk, obviously we're talking Sunday morning now, February 27th at noon Kiev time. Because of the cyber attacks on a lot of the Russian government sites, we really don't have as clear a notion of what the Russian counter-propaganda is. So I'm mostly going off of Ukrainian sources right now. The limited access I've seen to Russian stuff shows that they are really ramping up complete disinformation as to what exactly they are targeting. But they do occasionally put out useful information about what towns they're claiming to have captured. So today I don't have an hour-by-hour map, but I have a map of the front lines based on a combination of some of the briefings coming out of both Moscow and Kiev over the past couple of hours, which I will show briefly. Well, I'll pull it up so we can talk about the map here. The big news in terms of movements of the front is essentially on two of these approximately 9 or 10 fronts, if you want to imagine them. Firstly, the Sumy front is not going especially well for the Ukrainians. They continue, because the Russians advance very quickly, Ukrainian ability to do counter-infiltration has been pretty good out there. So I would not take this big bulge as worrying as it looks like at first glance. It's still fairly lightly populated, but it's still some place where a lot of towns have been surrounded and ultimately forced to surrender, such as Konotop and I believe Sumy itself, though. The last I heard, there's still some resistance inside the city of Sumy itself. The second major front movement is that the area northeast of Crimea has been advancing pretty rapidly over the course of Saturday, the 26th. So early in the morning, the Russians claim to have captured the city of Melitopol here, and subsequently are now saying that they have Berdyansk over here surrounded. I'm not certain of that yet, because there has not been sufficient Russian advance out of the Donbass front to suggest that that place actually is surrounded. The Ukrainians are also not acknowledging or intermittently acknowledging and not acknowledging that the Russians seem to have taken the town of forgetting the name of it now, but the town up here on the reservoir in order to start positioning grads to hit the city of Zaporozhye, which is here. So it appears that this front is probably going to be the most mobile over the next day or so. Sooner or later, I imagine it's going to Baghdad because the logistics lines are now getting quite long there. They've made some pretty rapid advances. But as we've discussed in previous episodes about Ukrainian strategic geography at large, this whole region here is one of the most easily accessible and prone to offensive terrains on the globe. So it's not too big a surprise that the Russians are able to make big movements. What is more surprising, I suppose, is the fact—
Nick, if I may interrupt, but the Ukrainians claimed a few times over yesterday, that they regained the control of Kherson, which is a critical juncture here. So there are conflicting, there's conflicting news about it. What is your opinion about this?
So I was just about to jump in there. So the city of Kherson itself is definitely still under Ukrainian control. The Russians are claiming this morning, this is a very crude line, so bear in mind this is probably a wild oversimplification. The Russians are claiming that they've taken control of the airfield and a couple of the suburbs directly around it on the north side and finally have it surrounded. But over the past couple of days, there has been a number of exchanges of this big bridge here at Antoniivka. So the Russians initially captured it on the first day, but the Ukrainians managed to push them back by the end of the first day, as I recall. The Russians, again, tried to retake it the next day, and the Ukrainians retook it at some point Friday as well. It appears from the most recent issuing of propaganda statements back and forth that the Russians are finally in control of the bridge and are making intermittent advances to different towns in this whole area. So we get reports now from the Ukrainians about Russians being sighted in a couple of the random villages out here. I don't think that it's a very large scale occupation to this point yet, but there's definitely some breakout. As of this morning, the Russian Ministry of Defense is claiming that they have the town more or less cut off. This one road out here, I haven't seen the Russians claiming they've cut off yet, so perhaps it's not completely surrounded. The Ukrainians continue to claim, and I believe they are correct, that the actual objective is not the city of Kherson here. It is actually to get up to Mykolaiv, which is substantially more strategically important because of its industrial base.
And also there were reports that there is some Spetsnaz or other parachute, units in Mykolaiv already.
That's another point that we need to consider. So we don't see any red lines on the map because there's no conventional front out here, but Spetsnaz was initially most active in Odessa and the neighboring areas, and now increasingly also in Mykolaiv as well. They have not been able to gain control of the city, but there's been a lot of disruption, especially attempts to take control of Ukrainian military infrastructure in those areas. We did see sometime over Friday to Saturday night, the Russian naval infantry attempt to land here at Kobleva, which is a beach resort, which is one of the places I believe we discussed, either we discussed or I discussed somewhere else about one of the easy beach access areas, since a lot of this has an escarpment for a escarpment instead of an actual level beach area as you would see down in this area. So they attempted to land at night, but the Russian naval infantry are not trained to do opposed amphibious landings at night. And so by all accounts, the Ukrainians beat them back. I forget which brigade. I want to say the 28th Motor Mechanized Brigade. I'm probably confusing the number, but a Ukrainian brigade beat them back pretty successfully. So there's no conventional front out here, and they've been since doing more mining of the beaches up and down the Odessa front. So there's probably a substantial chance of Spetsnaz being able to do rear area activities when this front eventually advances. But for the moment, it appears that the naval infantry gambit, which is why the Russians moved so many landing ships into the Black Sea initially, has not paid off. So another tactical Ukrainian victory. When we go to the Donbass front, we are now starting to see some movement. We did hear on the first day about an advance and a battle at Starobilsk, which is this intersection of roads up here in Lugansk Oblast. This one is difficult to track as there's the least information from both sides, which struck me that it was probably indecisive and neither side wanted to claim credit. Though it's unusual that the Ukrainians wouldn't claim some victory here, since usually it sounds like it was a Ukrainian victory, since I haven't heard anything about the Russians occupying it. However, the area in the northeast section has now been pacified pretty definitively as of Saturday night. So we should probably expect Starobilsk to be a major center of the battles today on Sunday. We are seeing very small-scale tactical advances across most of the Luhansk section of the Donbass front and a couple of areas closer to Volnovakha. So Volnovakha is the major transit section south of Donetsk. People will remember it as a major battlefield site in early 2014 as the primary link between Donetsk and Mariupol. The Russians have been unable to get into Volnovakha itself, but are starting to encircle it from the north. There's been a couple of advances also in the south, and a number of the towns which were previously jump-off points northeast of Mariupol have reported to be fallen. Mariupol itself, however, has still not collapsed or even really been seriously subjected to conventional attack yet. It's mostly still artillery strikes with a number of DRGs. So the Diversantные разведчики группа. So these are the saboteurs going in advance to try to break down enemy resolve and infrastructure to enable a conventional advance after them. So again, the line here is probably not this crudely drawn, but it's still interesting that Mariupol's continued to resist this long with really limited movement of that front. The Kharkov area, the Kharkov front's been the most interesting over the past night. The fighting there has been especially intense. There are competing claims going around Western media whether or not the city has fallen. It appears that it is still just DRGs in the city, but the fighting has clearly moved from the suburbs where the Ukrainians have been putting up pretty large-scale resistance, in particular this area, which is, let me turn the labels back on here. So I remember this particular area outside of Dorhachi was quite well contested over the past couple of days and appears to have now fallen, as well as this section here at Volchansk. The Ukrainians put up quite a fight for the first 2 days, but it seems that they've now been pushed back.
Yeah, since you're speaking about that, but generally speaking, also about the Southern Front and the Donbass and this Kharkov area and others, can we risk the assessment that the Ukrainians have already transitioned from the conventional warfare to some guerrilla warfare in terms of how they conduct the war, or it's still too early, or in part it is like this, in part it is still conventional? How does that stand at the moment?
So it's difficult to say. The readouts that we're getting through the fog of war suggest that there are still Ukrainian units behind the front line, especially on the Kharkov front and near the Crimean border, that are doing some guerrilla activities. It's not being characterized as such yet from Kiev itself, which leads me to think that this is still primarily a conventional war. But we are getting isolated reports of increasingly daring raids from the Ukrainians, which would suggest that the faith in doing a conventional defense might be switching. So I would not say that we've completely lapsed into a guerrilla war, though I think the transition has begun. So if we think of it as a spectrum, I would probably say we're still about 80 to 90% a conventional war at this point, but that's a lot more than zero, or a lot less than 100, you would say. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing a lot of firefighting going inside the city itself. I'm tempted to say that we'll see something decisive there this day, but honestly, the Russians seem pretty confident of a decisive battle for Kharkov as early as Thursday, and it still hasn't happened. So I certainly wouldn't give up on the prospects for the city's defense yet. There are as you can see from the road networks here, there are lots of options for the Russians to do conventional movements to encircle the city. And now that some of the outlying towns have fallen, or at least appear to have fallen, there are new options for the Russians to try to drive around the city instead of committing to an urban fight, which would make sense. If they can succeed in cutting off Kharkov, we've seen in a couple of other locations like Kharkiv and Konotop earlier on the Sumy front that they preferred to just surround and move on as opposed to trying to fight their way in, that they would probably be a pretty large-scale regroupment in order to do a subsequent push onto Dnipro, which is definitely a major strategic objective here.
Because I understand that between the front line, Kharkov and the Dnipro, so the Dnipro river line, there is only empty vacuum, empty space that can be traversed easily by Russians, right?
It seems that way. We are getting reports that, or at least getting claims that the Ukrainian forces might be withdrawing from the Donbass front soon. Which at this point, at least on the northern side, that's probably wise, because I don't think this situation over here east of Severodonetsk is going to be sustainable for too much longer.
Yeah, I was sort of thinking over
Yes.
the night. I was sort of thinking in that respect. I was thinking, and I gave the interview to radio yesterday evening in Warsaw. I claim that it's the time for the Ukrainian, politicians and the command to make a decision whether to withdraw forces from the Donbass just to consolidate the Dnieper River. And I wonder whether they've made this decision or not. So what do you think, Nick?
I haven't seen any discussion of that yet, though honestly, if they had made that decision, I suspect that they would not be broadcasting it. So may very well have, but it would be lost in the fog of war to this point.
And still, it would be difficult to move anyway, only on the cover of the night. They should have, right? So this night...
It's difficult to move for a variety of reasons. They're in the middle of doing evacuation of civilians, the remaining civilians from the frontline area. This is a heavily entrenched region where some of these units have been fighting for years now. So there's a lot of vested cultural interests in these particular places. The defenses actually are quite prepared. So as soon as you start withdrawing, you would expect a not precipitous, but a major morale collapse, in addition to which they're going to be on the move and therefore a lot more vulnerable to Russian non-contact strikes.
But still, just how do you judge the depth, the density, and the numbers around Kiev, Ukrainian numbers? They look thin, right, in terms of countering the Russian encroachment. So what is your take on that?
So just at the time that we recorded last time, it was becoming obvious that Kiev has become the overarching obsession of the Russian armed forces. And that really has not let up over the past couple of days. And obviously it makes sense from a strategic perspective that if you manage to cause a collapse in the capital itself, then you might be able to end the war much, much faster. What has not happened, despite Russian continuous claims, is that the Chernigov defense has held. So that first armored brigade is still holding its ground up in the north. Some maps are different. Some say that it's two separate lines of advance. What is clear is that the initial VDV reinforcements that were coming to the Hosmotil airfield that the Russians had captured on the first day, that the Ukrainians then recaptured that night, were redirected to Gomel and are now assisting in this offensive along this road here. But still, the fight has not ended. Indeed, this advance here, which is one of the first crossings of the border, it seems that they have not made virtually any progress into Ukraine either. So that brigade continues to hold, which forces all of the Russian hopes for an early victory in Kiev to this offensive down on the Chernobyl front.
Yeah.
The Russians did retake Hosmotil early Friday morning over the course of what appears to be a 3-hour battle, about 9 a.m. and finishing off around noon. But there has been remarkably little confirmed conventional gains since then. It seems like the Ukrainians successfully destroyed the bridges across some of the minor rivers connecting Irpin to the area of Hosmotil itself. The two main access points here are still at least nominally held by Ukraine. And so the main means that the Russians have been using in order to infiltrate the city has been using captured Ukrainian National Guard uniforms from the base in Hosmotil in order to send in decoys and sabotage groups into the city itself. Now, on Friday, they were attempting to do this more or less conventionally, sending in some armored vehicles into the city and then opening fire on some particular strategic areas. But this caused quite a lot of urban resistance. We've seen videos of firebombing from civilians as well as the conventional military pushing. The conventional military and the territorial defense and the National Guard all pushing back pretty heavily inside, especially these northwest suburbs here. There's also been a couple of further attempts, as we discussed last time, to try to take this Vishhorod neighborhood up here in order to gain control of the dam and possibly as well as the bridge over the river. So there's been continuous attempts to push out there using more subtle means, but they have not succeeded so far. There's a big battle sign over here because the emphasis since especially Saturday, but starting a bit on Friday evening, has been for the Russians to do essentially repeat the Hosmotil move into Volnivka airfield out here. This has been attempted a couple of times. The Ukrainians have successfully retaken it at least once, but the Russians have basically pulling the same move in Osmatiel. They just continue to shell this particular area and its defenders, and then continue to send heliborne VDV troops to try to take control of the airfield, with presumably the intention of bringing in a VDV regiment whenever they manage to finally take definitive control of the area, which would affect a much more effective surrounding of Kiev. Because with control of this particular area, you now have the capacity to do artillery strikes to permanently start sealing off some of these roads, which would drastically change the tactical situation. But to this point, the Russians have not secured that airfield, and it will probably continue to be a contested ground for the remainder of today. My suspicion is that when that falls, the Russians will then proceed to try to take Boryspil itself. And when that occurs, they can pretty much sit and start starving out the city. We did see last night, though, that...
How will they get to Boryspil? They need to break the defense of Chernihiv Front, right?
My suspicion is that they will just do another heliborne movement, possibly doing a full encirclement around from the south in order to avoid remaining air defense lines. Until the Chernigov Front breaks, there's not much hope from their side of doing a conventional surrounding. Now, the Chernigov Front might break almost at any time because of an ammunition shortage more than anything else. But until that ammunition shortage actually kicks in, I think that the Ukrainians have that front more or less secured if they can hold it this long. So that's where I believe the Russians are tactically going to next. I now want to talk briefly about the logistics situation, because the Ukrainians...
Nick, one more thing. Remember,
yes.
2 days ago, we were discussing this intrusion by the Russians from Belarus, along the line in Volhynia to Ruvne, and, trying to cut off maybe the Western approaches with ammunition and ammo from NATO countries. So what do you think about this? So what's going on there in terms of Lvov, Ruvne, and stuff?
So there was a report yesterday morning that the Russians had supposedly landed at one of the towns in Rivne Oblast, which is not showing up here. I believe Brody, I believe it was. And the mayor even sent out a notice that the Russians had taken control of it. Zooming in randomly, I believe it might have been Bartosiak, a town out there. And this was subsequently denied by the Ukrainian armed forces. They had claimed it was 3 helicopters carrying 60 guys to take control of an airfield at first. So at the moment, this has still not been affected. What we might expect if this were to occur, if it turns out that the Russians are going to move along this axis, I still think that their tactical reasoning, or at least, their operational reasoning would be to cut off the ability of Europeans to send additional armaments to Europe. Now,
so in that vein, do you think that the appearance of the American paratroopers close to the border, right there, plus the arrival of the American aviation, might signal to the Russians, and if they stop flowing the ammunition and weapons into Ukraine, there might be a sort of a air no-go zone established over the Western Ukraine or something, as some claim in the press. This was a NATO diplomatic pressure to sort of make sure that the Russians do not go towards Lvov and cut off the Western Ukraine from the supplies.
So honestly, I'm of the opinion that the Russians will believe it when they see it. These troop movements certainly mean that if the NATO decides to do something about a no-fly zone or managing to just secure Western Ukraine, that it will be substantially simpler for them to accomplish this. But honestly, we've seen the Russians provide quite a lot of very convenient targets for NATO Air Force bombing, and we have not done anything to this point. For reasons that I understand. If NATO starts going in there, it's very unpredictable what the Russians are going to do next. but it's still one of those things that until something starts to move, I don't see much sign that the Russians are going to take it seriously. And if NATO began occupying Western Ukraine just to secure the logistics lines, my reading is that the Russians would not be moving into Western Ukraine in order to stop them. My suspicion is that they would start taking other towns further into Ukraine, that's daring NATO further into the country in order to try to stop this off.
Mm-hmm.
So one point I would emphasize here, though, is that while we are seeing a pretty big mood swing across NATO members about donating additional equipment to the Ukrainians, and some of this is certainly going to be useful, especially ATGM, javelins, and even the Stingers as well for the man-pad air defense. This is not what the Ukrainians need most right now. And unfortunately, we don't really have too much of what they need most right now in NATO. The Ukrainian heavy weapons are all Soviet made, and they need more ammunition more than anything else. And as they run out of that, and the Russians went out of their way to make sure that that's what they hit at the beginning of this war. As they run out of that, I think the war is going to start to abruptly grind into a much more favorable situation for the Russians. Abruptly grind is a difficult way of putting it, but the thing is, it's going to be a grind until quite suddenly the Ukrainians start running out of ammunition on a major scale, and then we might see the front moving pretty rapidly.
And it's a good moment. It's a convenient moment, Nick, sorry to say it, because we receive reports from the field. You know, we have our contacts in the field, and we receive phone calls from inside of Ukraine that this has started happening, especially they are low on ammo. There is a lot of fuss about, on TV about sending weapons. All countries demonstrate their willingness, but on the field, there is a problem with that. I mean, the Ukrainians don't have the ammunition that they would need to engage the Russians, and as of today, that started to show in the Ukrainian military.
So we'll have to keep an eye on that.
Because many people will watch us, by the way, in the English-speaking world as well. So this is the signal from the field, guys. So move on and hurry up, so to speak.
Correct. I think Zelensky's line of "I need tank ammunition, not a ride" is actually pretty valid on all fronts. So that's going to be the key decisive variable that I'm going to be watching over the next couple of days. Is at what point does the ammunition start to run out, and what does the situation turn into then? As I started to say earlier, the Ukrainians over the past 18 hours or so are starting to make pretty loud noises about how they are disrupting Russian logistics, including such things as cutting off all rail links between Russia and Ukraine kinetically, as well as specifically targeting Russian fuel trucks. Now, I'm not going to say that this is a bad idea. This is, in fact, quite useful for making sure that the Russians cannot move about. But all the reports I'm seeing so far show that it's not affecting the Russian ability to continue to move things between fronts at the operational tactical level. It might be making an impact at the very front line, in which case we need people from the front line to tell us that. But those people from the front line are not talking on the internet for good reason. I'm glad they're not. And so I can't say to what extent that is actually impacting things at the absolute front. But at least in terms of Russian progress, it appears that limitations on fuel is not yet stopping the Russian advance. What's stopping the Russian advance at the moment continues to be Ukrainian resolve more than anything. But still, I wouldn't say that hitting logistics is a bad idea. I think hitting logistics is probably a particularly good one. It's just that this is a particular specialty of the Russian armed forces. And unless you can really start to completely stop Russian movement of logistics inside your own territory, then it's not going to have a major impact.
So what you're implying, just to clarify for our audience, is that the Russians have been notorious for bad logistics in their military, but that means that they know how to rebuild it and how to keep it flowing in the conditions that usually Westerners have no clue how to deal with that. That's what you were implying, right, Nick?
Yes, it's a bit of historical Russian specialty to fix a logistics catastrophe because, as everybody knows, just look at it, do a Google image search of Russian roads. You'll see that the Russian logistics are not very good during peacetime. So the logistics forces, the armed forces, are justly proud of the fact that they can solve it for this crisis. But if we look at the map at large, we can easily see that cutting off logistic trains along this front, the Sumy front, assuming that this is as far as the Russians have gotten it, would actually be quite effective at stopping continued Russian movement at the front line around Nizhyn, which is where the Ukrainians said that they're currently a tank concentration getting ready to advance further. By contrast, if we're looking at more like the Chernigov or the Chernobyl area, there's not too many Ukrainians already in position in order to do proper harassment at the front. And then Chernigov, they just have not advanced particularly far. Unless you're advancing into Belarusian territory, it's difficult to actually put a stymie on this. And then in Kharkov as well, the Russians are not very far over the border, so it's difficult to say. Now down here, again, if they're hitting fuel trucks, that's actually a big deal. So the good news for the Ukrainians is that if the farther the Russians advance, the more this logistical disruption is going to have a potential operational effect. The bad news is that the most strategic front they've got, the Kiev defense itself, there's not too much territory with which to disrupt the Russian advance, unless they're going to take the fight into Belarus itself.
Yeah, so we touched upon the, and also off the record, you were telling me that the Ukrainians are winning the tactical engagements, very competent at tactical level, but you are worried, as far as I understood, at the operational level and how it, unfolds. Could you elaborate on that, Nick?
I mean, the biggest difficulty we have here is that, and this is a problem across all of Europe, once the Ukrainians run out of ammunition, once the Ukrainians manage to get surrounded after successfully fighting for a particularly long time, they may have taken down tens of thousands of Russians. The Ukrainians are currently claiming that that somewhere between 3,000 and 3,500 Russians have so far become casualties of this war. The Russians are able to just add more things into this mess. So the Ukrainians keep saying that the Russians are engaging their reserves. They're engaging their reserves. But the Pentagon came out Friday night and said that as far as they can see, only about 1/3 of the Russian troop concentration around Ukraine has actually so far been engaged. And obviously this is now a couple days old, but I think the Pentagon is pretty much correct. We're not seeing an overwhelming mass at the front, which is what we were initially anticipating. As to a large extent, the initial Russian strategy was try to get to operational objectives extremely fast in the hope that the Ukrainians would just snap. But that obviously has not happened. So we're sort of stuck in this very vintage World War II style slog at the moment. But if you start running out of munitions, it's not ultimately going to matter if the Russians can keep driving around to surround you. So even if the Russians themselves are having difficulties with supply chain, keeping ammunition and logistics to the front line, so long as they continue to move and you just can't shoot at them anymore, they will eventually gain the advantage and win. And now the good news from a Ukrainian perspective is that if the losses are sufficiently big to the Russians, then it might very well start to cause severe political problems for Russia at home. And in addition to which, the Ukrainians don't have to win this war at the conventional stage in order to ultimately win. In fact, that's where I think we are going, is that even if the Ukrainians do ultimately lose the conventional war sometime in the next 7 days, they've got the morale sufficiently high that I think the possibility of a successful insurgency is now substantially greater than it was prior to the Russian invasion starting on Thursday. So on that front, I think Ukrainian statehood, or at least identity, has certainly been preserved to a much larger extent than anybody, including myself, was anticipating prior to the Russians launching a pretty flawed invasion concept.
Don't you think that the Russians wanted to achieve the same method as the Americans in the Second Iraqi War, when they were moving directly on towards Baghdad and they got bogged down in the Karbala Gap? Remember this thing?
Yes, I think that the Russians actually had that very much in mind. And we see this in that, just the fact that the Russians really did a very, very minimal amount of long-range strike preparation of Ukraine relative to what we would expect the Russians to do from their own exercises and from their experience, especially in Syria. What they did was they took out the airfields and the munitions dumps as much as they could, but they didn't suppress the airfields permanently, because I think that they thought the Ukrainian Air Force wasn't going to be very effective. They just needed it to not be functional at the beginning, and hopefully they could just shock the army into collapsing. And so they then piled over the border within a couple of hours. We said last time about 700 hours, the Russians had already overwhelmed most of the border checkpoints that they've been using so far in this invasion. And that's just not how the Russians typically exercise. So the objective appears to have been, since they were prioritizing mobility over survivability at every point that we were able to observe, is that by simply getting to a number of the operational checkpoints, they would cause the Ukrainians to believe that the country was in collapse, and then hopefully cause a morale collapse that would in turn end resistance. When this did not happen over the course of Thursday, and when in particular, the Zmysky Island defenders sent out their message about telling the Russians to get stuffed in stronger language, as well as the Ukrainian victory at the first Battle of Hostomel, the Ukrainian morale went so high that the resolve has not been broken by the fact that the Russians do have superior air capabilities. In fact, even though the Russians do have ongoing air capabilities over the country, the fact that the Ukrainians keep shooting down Russian aircraft, including this one guy who's apparently shot down either five or six aircraft as of yesterday, perhaps even more by now, by himself, suggests that the morale is only going to continue to explode explode in a good way on the Ukrainian side. And as we said last time, if the Ukrainians can continue to put out the message that their institutions are functioning, then the conventional fight is going to continue. Now, everything begins to switch when Kiev when Kiev falls or becomes surrounded. We did see last night that the Russians made a big move to try to take out one of the major electric power stations in the northeast suburbs of Kiev, apparently crossing over from Vizhhorod to do some sabotage activity there. I did not see any word on whether or not they had succeeded. It appears they did not. But in response, we saw a whole bunch of things, including Elon Musk deploying Starlink to Ukraine, which, among other things, means that Kiev, so long as it's got electricity, is going to have internet access. And while this doesn't sound all that useful in the long term, or in a strict tactical sense, we can imagine in any Western city, what if in a war, all the enemy did was turn off internet privileges to the city livers? City slickers, how long would it take for them to start acquiescing to certain demands? I think so long as the Kiev people are posting information about what's going on in the city, especially if the Russians have to commit to a siege in order to force surrender, I think this is going to continue to mount morale in the same way that places like the siege of Leningrad or Stalingrad did during the Second World War, the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and what do you think about the warfare itself? What would you say about the effectiveness of Russian BTGs? Maybe they were too short on the indirect fires on signals and other things, and it turned out that they don't have infantry to really storm the cities.
Again, it's difficult to do a complete readout during the current fog of war, but I think we discussed in the past, if not, we should have discussed in the past, the battalion tactical group concept was invented during the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan for how to do mountain warfare, how to do complex operations when your different units operating within a Soviet front system are not going to be in constant contact with each other. And the Russian General Staff, or at least elements of it, concluded over the past 10 years that this was going to be useful even in flat terrain like Ukraine, because the force to space ratio in the 21st century is substantially lower than it was in the 20th and before. And so the anticipation was that these units are not going to be operating directly next to each other, so they need to be able to support themselves by themselves as they're moving about. I don't think that the BTG concept itself is therefore flawed. I think the problem is that it's designed in order to accomplish its objectives through strikes. It's got enough munitions in order to sustain doing large-scale artillery strikes, as well as firepower, such that its maneuver capabilities are really a last gasp for what its capabilities are supposed to be doing. The maneuver is supposed to be used at the end for shock purposes. Because the Russians decided to start with doing a maneuver warfare, to use that as the shock from the beginning, and hopefully, from their perspective, it appears, to get war termination very quickly, that logic has come apart. And so some of the weaknesses of the BTGs have been exposed. But the other thing that we're seeing at the front is that the Ukrainians are capturing conscripts. Now, I think we mentioned this on our last video. If there are conscripts at the front, these are not battalion tactical groups the way that we have understood them over the past couple of years. Battalion tactical groups are designed to be all conscript, and so therefore keep their morale up and indeed be ready to act under what will appear to be difficult circumstances where their manpower is going to be potentially surrounded. But if they rely on artillery strikes and the fact that there will be some form of logistical resupply, then they can they should be able to hold out in the same way that a pikeman who manages to not break ranks in front of a charging cavalry charge will always beat the horse, even though it looks scary. So from that perspective, we see that either the Russians have done some substantial reforms to the BTGs or really watered down their requirements for the BTGs since they've needed to generate so many for this conflict, or these are not, in fact, battalion tactical groups fighting. If these are not battalion tactical group fighting, this is old-style brigades, then I think what's quite obvious is that brigade-scale warfare in Russia does not work. I don't think anybody would say that that was a surprise before Thursday. But again, in the fog of war, as we currently have it, we don't know for certain what is being deployed. I would just say, as a conclusion, that just because the Russians have been bogged down does not necessarily mean the BTG concept is flawed or that even the BTG concept was deployed. I think what ended up happening is that the BTGs were not used in the way that they were supposed to, and that has really given the Russians some problems.
Yeah. So, and at last, Nick, so you promised to tell me what you think about the Polish role and what Poland should do, or what, implications for Poland might be.
So perhaps the most important lesson we've seen so far, I don't think it's going to surprise too many of our Strategy&Future viewers, is the Ukrainians have practically unlimited manpower because the Russians attacked in a way that was so predictable, and in a way that the Ukrainians were able to win initial tactical victories, and in a way that just looks honestly like it's Hitler reborn, at least in the short term, and possibly even for the long term if the current diplomatic front continues to go so badly for the Russians. We have people volunteering on every front. So just jamming a whole bunch of people into uniforms is going to be a major Ukrainian strength. But at the same time, what we're seeing here is that the operational situation is still fairly dire for the Ukrainians in the medium term. Even though we might say a week-long war was not what the Russians wanted, the Ukrainians should be proud of themselves for outperforming, and they should be proud of themselves for outperforming. I think it's shameful that NATO is not doing even the slightest thing to even the odds by eliminating Russian armored power that's very vulnerable and in a place where it should not legally be. But that's a separate point. Manpower is not going to be the decisive factor here. nor is sending a bunch of fancy equipment that the Ukrainians don't have fully integrated into their system. So yeah, we can send more javelins. Javelins are at least useful because they're fairly easy to learn. Shoving more complex technical equipment at the last minute would not have changed the circumstance as it was, if only because of, again, munitions limitations. What has been the key to Ukrainian success so far, in addition to morale being so high, is simply the fact that because this was so obvious, and that on top of that, even those Ukrainian leaders who thought that this was not actually about them the entire time were pretty convinced that things had changed by Monday when Putin gave the speech about what he thinks about Ukraine anyhow. Situational awareness and readiness were so high that the Ukrainians were ready for the Russian attack. So by raising readiness and by having by not relying on complex systems, the Ukrainians are still operating mostly Soviet equipment, to be honest, with a couple of
and in this C2, that is sector, sector commanders are making decisions without listening to the headquarters. That's what it looks like. Yeah, so you cannot decapitate the command structure, apparently.
Correct. In many of these ways, the Ukrainians are really being very innovative at the tactical level in a way that Poland should study. As I said before, I don't think any of our strategy and future viewers are going to be terribly surprised to hear us say that making a bigger and bigger Polish military is not necessarily the answer. What's necessary is to make sure that readiness is prepared, that you have the munitions in place in order to actually fight the enemy. And perhaps most importantly of all, unlike Ukraine, Polish strategic objectives, mostly Warsaw, have territorial space between them and potential enemy territory. So there is room to do serious harassment of enemy logistics in a manner that cannot simply be overwhelmed, especially if you can keep that harassment up.
Yeah.
I don't expect there to be a major ability to do a push out of the Sumy advance here, the Sumy Bulls, let's call it, unless the Ukrainians completely run out of ammunition at the front.
Yeah.
So I do think that by reforming Polish tactics to have much higher readiness forces that are simply ready to encounter the Russians when they finally come, and by making sure that they're not overloaded with complicated equipment that can't necessarily talk to each other, what you're going to run out of because there's not very much of it, you can cause a substantial tactical victory, which if you start, which we need to still go through how do you translate that into operational success. But I think that Poland has some serious options to at least experiment with how to stop Russian strategic.
Let alone that our situation is better because our terrain is more confined in terms of the axis of advances. Plus, we can manipulate terrain much better than the Ukrainians, which they apparently didn't prior to the war, to the extent that they should have, even for the sake of trying not to escalate, under the pressure of the West, not to escalate and stuff. And also, there is one major, conclusion, or at least conclusion at this stage, is that, look, on day one, there was not so much talk about help from the West. Ukrainians were on their own. The expectation was that they would collapse quite quickly, right, Nick?
Oh, yes.
And things started changing on day three. And finally, as we speak today, it seems that the flow has changed and the mood has changed, and maybe there will be a major help in terms of ammo from all corners of the world and other sanctions against Russia. Still, of course, with some caveats, but sanctions. So you need to fight. You need to stay on the escalation ladder. You need to competently fight. You need to show your stamina in order to have some political decisions made.
The one thing that we need to be aware of, though, is that the center of gravity now is what is going to collapse first? Is it the Ukrainian armed forces, or is it the Russian political system? And if the Ukrainian armed forces collapse, they can continue into an insurgency. But in the short term, we are talking about, will there be sufficient political instability in Russia that the Putin regime needs to find a way to de-escalate?
Yeah.
My personal guess is that if Putin starts to do that, then the regime will rapidly collapse and have to do something else. So it's going to have to be pretty substantial. But we are already hearing from Western reporters having their hotels, Western reporters in Moscow having their hotels demand that they pay them now before SWIFT gets cut off. So it's going to be a particularly precarious situation in Russia for the next couple of weeks.
And that's the theory of victory for Ukraine. So attrition, and galvanizing the Western support because of the bravery and attrition inflicted on the Russian soldiers that galvanized the Western support. That's how I would describe it. And maybe that's a good moment to end this part of our conversation. Thank you, Nick. Thank you very much. And you all stay with us at Strategy and Future. My guest today was Nicholas Myers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jacek.